Heat and temperature. What in the world is the difference between those two? Well, heat is the transfer of energy from one thing to another. Temperature is basically a measure of the motion of that makes up the molecules of a substance. So when we're talking about heat and temperature, we also have to talk about thermal energy. Thermal energy is the energy that molecules have. Molecules are constantly moving. They are constantly in motion. And so as they're moving around, they're bumping into each other. As they're bumping into each other, that is a transfer of that energy. And so that is in essence heat. Energy will always go from a high energy state to a low energy state. Now, when we're talking about heat and temperature, we have to kind of use all three of those terms interchangeably. We need to be talking about thermal energy, the energy that makes up the molecules. We have to talk about heat, which is the transfer of the energy. As those molecules are moving around, they're bumping into each other. And so when two things are next to each other, one is has lots of internal energy, that thermal energy is really high, and one with thermal energy that's really low. Well, all those molecules moving around really fast, all that energy will get transferred to the object there where the molecules aren't moving as much. And so that is heat, the transfer of energy. Now, how do we measure all that energy? We measure it from temperature. Temperature is a measurement of the internal kinetic energy. It's the average kinetic energy of all the molecules that make up a substance. So we have to talk about thermal energy, we have to talk about heat, and we have to talk about temperature when we're talking about heat, energy, and temperature all together. Now, normally when we say, oh, well, what is heat? We think of hot, things that are hot, things that are cold. But remember, heat is the transfer of energy. Hot and cold is relative. Some people think things are hot, other people think things are cold. I mean, let's think about the temperature of a room. Temperature of the room, let's say, is about 70 degrees. Well, in the summertime, you walk into a 70-degree room, you're going to be cooled off. It's going to feel like that room is really cold. However, if you walk into a 70-degree room that is in the wintertime, well, you're going to think that room is really warm. And so the way we feel things, that hot and coldness, is relative and is different for the situation that we're in. Normally, when we think about something that is really hot or really cold, what we are kind of figuring out is how that energy is getting transferred. If energy is getting transferred into you, then it means that that object is going to be hot. That energy is going from that energy, that thermal motion of those molecules in that object is getting transferred. All that energy is getting transferred to you, and you feel like it's very warm. Now, if you're touching something that is cold, well, the reason it feels cold is because you're losing energy. Your body, your hand is touching something, let's say a piece of metal. Well, your hand is really warm compared to that metal, and so all the energy, all the thermal motion at the palm of your hand is getting transferred to the thermal motion of the metal. And so you're losing energy, and since you're losing energy, it's going to feel cold. However, if your temperature or your thermal energy was less than whatever that metal was, then you would think it would be hot. And so hot and cold is completely relative. It's all based on how those things are touching. Which one has more energy? Remember, energy always goes from the higher energy to lower energy. Now, how does that energy get transferred? How is heat transferred? Well, heat is transferred in three different ways. You can have conduction, you can have radiation, and you can have convection. So let's talk about each one of those terms. Conduction. Conduction is where you actually are physically touching something. When two things are touching together or in close contact, then that energy can go from one object to another. That is conduction. So conduction can only happen whenever there is close contact between two objects. That is conduction. What about radiation? Radiation is energy transferred through electromagnetic waves. So as the energy gets transferred through space, that energy gets to you, and so that is what we call radiation. The third type of way heat gets transferred is through convection, and that is the mass movement of air, or mass movement of, it doesn't have to be air, of a fluid, I should say. So if you have a large amount of fluid and it has the temperature, the way those molecules, the thermal energy of those molecules that make up that fluid, well, as it's moving around, the density of that object is going to change. Density is mass over volume. So if they're moving around really quickly, they have a very large volume, and so therefore the density is going to decrease because we're dividing by a large value. So therefore it will end up moving upward. Lower density objects move up. If it's colder, meaning that or not as much energy, those molecules are going to get closer together. It's not going to take up as much volume, and so it's going to end up moving down. So that movement of masses going up and down, kind of rotating, that is what we call convection. Where do you experience convection? You experience it in HVAC, heating and air conditioning. So basically how your house, how your dorm, how your classroom is being heated or cooled is through convection. If you look in the room that you're sitting in right now, especially if it's a classroom, you will always see like there's a vent. Well, that vent, there's usually two vents. There's a vent where the air's coming out, and then there's an intake where the air is moving back in. And so air is moving in and going out of the room. And so that mass movement of air is what we call convection. There's also convection ovens. Convection ovens is basically has a heating element, and there's a fan in the back that moves, and it moves the air around so things can heat evenly. And so convection is the mass movement of air. Large, or I should say a fluid, because the same thing can happen in water. The movement of water going from hot and cold and evenly dispersed. So convection is another way heat can get transferred. So 3 different ways heat can transfer. We can have conduction, we can have radiation, and then we can have convection.